Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. As many of you know, this is our fourth and final symposium of the year. This year we've had an opportunity to revisit Jim Cabot's core research ideas to see how they've evolved in the first decade of the Cabot Center's existence. Today we will hear about a new area of research that provides one idea of what Cabot's ideas might look like as we move further into the 21st century. Jen Lacy will be talking about the maker movement, which is an emerging educational innovation that capitalizes on ideas like democratizing access to powerful ideas, using technology to support STEM learning, and bringing forward-looking curriculum reforms to scale. While Cabot did not do maker research, his big ideas clearly provide a foundation for this work. To engage us in thinking about making and STEM learning, Dr. Lacy will be talking about making a STEM course. Dr. Lacy completed her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she focused on the intersection of making, high school vocation and manual education, and the politics of academic tracking. Jen is currently a high school science teacher in Kansas City, where she focuses on creating climate change and social justice curricula that encourage students to think critically about race and racism by studying biological concepts in parallel with the history of science and the eugenics movement. She's also the co-founder of an organization called American Daughters, which is a nonprofit women's leadership organization. And we're thrilled to have her here.
Hey, thank you. So I've tried to create a talk that shares my dissertation research, in which I studied a Fab Lab, and the idea was that they are making a STEM course. This was supposed to be like the first interdisciplinary course at this high school. And so I just looked at all the different aspects of it. I got to spend almost a year in the school. The first part just kind of developing relationships, and then the second semester collecting data. So it was really interesting to spend so much time getting to see all the structure and the politics of schooling and how it's related to this new course being made. So that's what I'll be presenting on today. All right, some backgrounds. Some of this you probably can't read, which is fine. But making is really interesting. I've talked about, like, people have been making forever, but now it's like a word we use, which is weird. And when I was doing my lit review, it was like, what do I call this? Because it's called so many different things. So the best definition I think is valuable is making is focused on designing, building, modifying, and or reproducing material objects for playful or useful ends, oriented toward making a product of some sort that can be used, interacted with, or demonstrated. And depending on who's making, a lot of what's popular about making is the digital fabrication technologies. But of course, we've had woodworking shops and metal shops in home economics and art classes for 100 years, you know, in high schools. So there's nothing new. The maker movement is, I think, a lot of different levels. There are, you know, for-profit maker spaces, and then there's some libraries and museums for more educational purposes. We have the whole entrepreneurial side of making. And maker spaces can be in lots of different places. Sometimes they're called tech shops. The one that I observed is called a Fab Lab, a fabrication laboratory, and it was modeled off the one at MIT. And making right now is becoming very popular, as STEM is also becoming popular in how in the next generation science standards that are much more interdisciplinary than previous standards. And but a lot of my research was first looking at the progressive movements and how they started. So the manual training movement and home economics, it was really important for me to see how those came into high schools to understand this new thing that's coming in, and really being able to compare and contrast what I'm seeing or what I saw in this class. The research questions I focused on: how does the design and implementation of the North Fab Lab learning environment, curriculum affect how instructors and students see themselves engaging in science. So I'm a science educator. I wanted to know how they think they're engaging in science, and then how does the Fab Lab contribute to or depart from the social sorting practices that already take place at North High School. So as a high school teacher, I'm very much aware that there are tracks. Even though we don't call them tracks anymore, we sort students, and it's very unfortunate that we do. So I wanted to see, how is the Fab Lab going to fit into this? Because the school where the Fab Lab is created already has a woodworking and metal shop, has home economics, has art, has all these making courses. So why do they need a new one? And how are they kind of justifying that they need this new Fab Lab? How does it fit into all of that? So theoretical perspectives that really helped me look at my work is kind of the theme of boundaries. So Guerin's work of the rhetorical symbols of science, I wanted to see how they're talking about science, what, just like how they use the language of science in the Fab Lab. The material symbols, so I was looking at the learning environment, how does science show up in the, as far as symbols go. And what I found was that how we talk about science, or our ideas of language around science, plus the materials, representations of science, create an imagery of science in the school. And it has social ends, meaning if we can convince donors that science is taking place in here, we get money. If we can convince, what students are we trying to convince that this course is going to lead to a career in engineering? There's all these social ends of like who shows up and how's it funded and lots of other things that you could see. I conducted a case study of a formal makerspace I observed an introductory Fab Lab course for one semester at a public high school. I also observed an introductory woodworking course, but that didn't come until a few weeks in, and so I wouldn't say it was a comparative case study. I didn't look at them on equivalent levels, but the woodworking course helped provide contrast for me. It allowed me to see things that I wasn't able to see before, like the woodworking students wear these heavy denim aprons when they work, and there seems to be a purpose for those. Like when they're staining things. And then it wasn't until I noticed what they were wearing that I noticed there's white lab coats hanging in the Fab Lab. Why did they need white lab coats? They don't. But it was a symbol that I noticed, and I wouldn't have if I didn't see what other artifacts were being used in the process of making. So yeah, case study design allowed me to observe how the design and implementation of the Fab Lab relates to existing school structures, like categorizing and sorting students. All right, the setting, you can't see this, it's not a great picture because it's all blown out. But the Fab Lab has the chemical resistant black lab tables. They have lab benches. It's painted white, it's very clean. It's quiet. There are lab coats hanging off in the corner. This is the main room. There's 3 main tables. There's laser cutters over here. There's CNC machines over here. There's like 4 or 5 3D printers on the other wall. In this room, there's a computer lab, and then there was a separate ShopBot room where they had this giant ShopBot CNC routing tool that was very loud. So they created its own room, so the Fab Lab could remain this quiet laboratory. This is the current governor of Wisconsin visiting. He's holding a quadcopter that one of the students had created. You can see they're wearing the lab coats, so they did wear lab coats when people visited.
That looks like a stock photo.
It does. It is. So, and they pulled out the best projects, of course, you know, when they want funding. Everyone needs funding. So the North Fab Lab provided this unusual opportunity to observe a newly developed Fab Lab designed to engage students in making and STEM through digital fabrication. And it was almost exclusively digital. So there was no hand tools besides if they were like cutting up stock pieces of things. So this was, the instructors called it an organized version or a package of the maker movement. That's how they described the Fab Lab. It was a public and private partnership. So engineering firms gave money to the Fab Lab. And then there was an instructor who was a former engineer that then got the school kind of hired to help develop it, and he was there almost every day. So he helped get grants from like Honda and other places to get all this stuff. And then the school really just provided the space and I guess instructors. They're now paying for those. So all of the tools come from the MIT Fab Lab. If you search it, they have an Ideal Lab layout, and so they got all the tools that were a part of this lab. So the instructor participants, I ended up observing a lot of people. Not observing, but I ended up interviewing a lot of people. I observed Mr. Carson, who's a Fab Lab 1 teacher. He also taught math. And you can see he teaches AP Calculus. He is also in charge of the Talented and Gifted program. This will be helpful when we see what types of students are taking Fab Lab courses. I interviewed Ms. Rhodes. It came to, at the end of my study, I realized it'd be nice to get an outsider's perspective of what's happening in the Fab Lab. I interviewed a science teacher who was training to be a Fab Lab teacher. And then Mr. Mitchell, who was an instructor volunteer. And then I also ended up observing the woodworking teacher as well and interviewing him several times. There were several students that I followed around and studied. A few things. There was these 3 male students had also taken woodworking at one time. These students hadn't. They had just taken Fab Lab. And Rachel and Gwen were the only female students in my study, and they were the only female students in the class. So there was about 20 students in the class, and so these are, of those, I was able to observe 100%. 7 or 8. Some of the data sources, I had 30 visits in the Fab Lab. I was there about every other day. Woodworking started a little later. The instructors were interviewed twice. The students were interviewed once. And then I got access to all their projects, of course, handouts, press interviews, all of that stuff. So I'll just start out with some of my findings and then show you some examples of how I think they played out. So part 1, I looked at the material, culture, and rhetoric of science in the North Fab Lab. And what I found was the North Fab Lab relies on artifacts and rhetoric, symbolic of science and STEM, to set itself apart from other design-based learning environments and curricula at North High School. And the North Fab Lab instructors and students were unable to explain what they were doing in the Fab Lab is science when I asked them, or in analyzing all the coursework and stuff, and instead relied on vague and unsupported claims related to interdisciplinary STEM practices and dated descriptions of science. So a couple of things. When I interviewed the science teacher, she said that they had adopted the NGSS, Science and Engineering Practices. She told me that right off the bat. So that was something that I was looking for in the Fab Lab. Well, how is this showing up in the Fab Lab? So I've listed a few of the science ones because I'm a science educator. So one things I were looking for is like developing and using models, using mathematics, interpreting data, constructing explanations, and then some of the engineering ones as well. I have my PhD minor is in design-based learning, so I was looking for what problems are they trying to solve, their prototypes, like looking for like iterations of design, who are their audience members. I was looking for those types of things too. And what I found was with the first question is, and this all has to do with the rhetoric and material culture of science, was the first one that my kind of finding is it's science because it's STEM, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So on the Fab Lab, the first thing on their website is science, technology, engineering, art, and math all come together in our state-of-the-art digital fabrication laboratory. So that was my first interview question, was how do you see science, playing out? And so these are some of the, I don't have all of them, all of the quotes about it, but some of the ones that were pretty common. So the science teacher said the idea of designing something, prototyping it, oh, that didn't work, let's go back, I need to tweak this. So that's her response when I asked her how she sees science taking place in the Fab Lab, which to me, though, that sounds more engineering based. Students would say, a lot I would hear, well, it's trial and error, so it's science, which are newer ideas of what science is not trial and error. It's and one student seemed to think, well, I know there's math in there, so there's also science. He says, I feel like math and the rest of it goes into science, so therefore science isn't necessarily a single subject. There's a science involved in everything. It's like a place where there's no single multiple subject, it's one subject. So because it's a STEM classroom and there's a lot going on, then science is in there. And so, and that was something I heard a lot, was like, well, there's a science in everything. You can use science in every situation, so it's there. But they could never give me any explicit like scientific concepts that they had learned, or how they, like theories or anything that they had used to help explain what they were doing. So that was something I saw, is that, well, it's got to be in there, because there's a lot going on in this class.
Jim?
Yeah.
Did you notice that the science teachers saw that the engineering teachers were thinking differently?
Well, that's another thing. We didn't have any engineering teachers teaching in the Fab Lab. So we have a separate CTE teacher. They had a separate technology and engineering department. But it's funny they never mentioned engineering, they referred to it as tech ed. So that was one part of when as a way to give back to the school, I provided them with some feedback on things that I had learned. And one was, it doesn't seem that anyone knows the engineering design process, because I didn't see it. But I was surprised, though, that even the science teacher had very vague ideas of what science looks like in STEM learning environments. Another thing, so I guess in conclusion of this is like, the rhetoric of science was just more like, it's just such a broad thing, you can't really narrow it down, I guess. Another thing I looked at was, it is called Fab Lab, not Fab Shop. And the way I saw this showing up was the material culture of the room. There were white walls, lab benches, the machines were quiet, they had white lab coats. They really tried to distinguish themselves from the shop. And once I got into the shop, it really became clear the differences. The shop was really noisy. You didn't have students sitting around talking, like in the Fab Lab. They would take the air gun and like clean themselves off after shop. There was no need to clean up after the Fab Lab. The kids in the shop class had chores. you know, like 1 week you're sweeping or you're wiping down tables. Fab Lab didn't have that. So it really became clear that they were modeling this Fab Lab, trying to model after science labs, even though we've been in science labs before, and they're not exactly, some of them, as nice as this Fab Lab. So, but Mr. Mitchell, he's the guy that really helped put the Fab Lab together. He said the Fab Lab was intentionally designed to reflect a lab and not a shop. It's a big space, feel open like a lab, not like a shop. Like I said, when the governor and lieutenant governor came, the students wore lab coats. It had the Fab Lab logo on it. And so what I saw was like what one might call like the Fab Lab was science-y. You know, they had the language, they talked about STEM, they talked about these very kind of dated science ways of talking, like it's trial and error, it's learning from your mistakes, it's and then the space had these popular images of science that you might see in the media, like lab coats, people sitting around, you know, quiet machines that are, you know, doing things, and so it had a very sciencey feel to it. And then the other thing that I noticed was often people thought science was going on because there were really cool technologies going on. And so, like I said, the Fab Lab was almost exclusively digital fabrication. We had 3D printers, laser cutters, CNC routers. When I asked the participants, do you think taking a woodworking course would provide the same opportunities to engage in science? They often said no because of the dated equipment in the wood shop.
Wow.
So you hear things like this. This is from the guy who helped start the Fab Lab. I mean, if you look at myself, born in the industrial age, our learning was in that noisy, dusty shop, right? But that's not this generation. This is the digital revolution, not the industrial revolution. I really preach that because that's the truth, that these kids aren't learning the way that I learned. They shouldn't have the same tools. It's a different world. And then a student says, this student never has taken a woodshop class. So with the woodshop class, I mean, it's kind of the same thing as the Fab Lab, but you don't have the intuitive design. It's more primitive. This kid was I mean, here you're using lasers. Over there, you're using a 6-bit saw. Some other things. So some members of the Fab Lab associate the newness of digital fabrication technology with a sense of awe they experienced while observing them with engagement with science. In one case, one afternoon when Nate and a friend were watching the laser cutter cut an image into an acrylic keychain, Nate leaned over the machine and he said, "Science, science." Another story that I really like, a way that more scientific rhetoric came in, is when you talk about science, you often hear words like it's more objective, it's precise, there's more accuracy than other things. In a story, a student wanted to make ping pong paddles using the CNC machine. And so he had this design and he cut it out. With a CNC router, the bit does not leave a smooth edge around. And so this kid wanted to sand off the rough edge. And so this other kid, who had taken woodworking classes, was like, "I'll take you to the wood shop and we'll get some sandpaper." And the teacher, the Fab Lab teacher, said, "No, we don't use manual tool, like sandpaper, because then it won't be exact." We use that word a lot, that the digital fabrication technology could create exactly what you wanted, whereas handmade artifacts wouldn't be exact. And this kid really pushed back because he was in advanced woodworking. He's like, "No, you still, in the wood shop, you cut it out, use a pencil, and then you sand it and you get it, what the measurement should be. You can get it pretty exact." And they kind of went back and forth, but this kid wasn't convinced. He was like, "No, you can't create exactly what you want in the wood shop too." And later on, he was kind of, he would often take students over to the wood shop and show them how to use different things. Because the kid would be like, well, I don't want to set up this whole measurement thing and then cut it out. And the kid would be like, yeah, let's just go over to the bandsaw and I'll just do it real fast. And then you can. So it was interesting how the students were kind of rebelling against the boundary that had been created between the wood shop and the Fab Lab. So I heard this exactness a lot, which I thought sounded, was more the rhetoric of like science versus craftsmanship, which is, so in other words, the Fab Lab, this idea that the Fab Lab engages in science because it contains advanced technologies, a common symbol of science. So with this first finding, these findings point to how artifacts and rhetoric, symbolic of science, STEM, and interdisciplinary education, when attached to design-based activities, making, and Fab Labs, create the impression that participants are engaging in science when in fact their activities do not match up with the characterization of science in the NGSS and other documents. And I'll show you more of that, some examples. So there may be some practicing teachers in here. So some of the advice I gave to the teachers, which didn't show up in my dissertation, some of it draws on how can you actually do science instead of just appearing science-y. So one thing Blickstein, a maker researcher, warns against is the keychain syndrome, the ability to generate aesthetically pleasing products with little effort. I saw that a lot in the Fab Lab. The student would go to Google Image or Thingiverse and download something, the 3D printer or laser cutter would make it, and if you were an outsider that came in, you would think, oh my God, these students are making these really amazing things, when really a lot of it was just they were downloading things. And a lot of the projects these students had to do were them just using the technology, not actually doing the designing thing. And they actually, their first project, it's funny that he warns against the keychain syndrome, because that was their first project. They made a keychain, and so they would download their favorite, like, soccer team's logo, and then it would be etched onto a keychain. Yeah. So I saw a lot of that. But from outsiders, like when the governor comes in and sees this quadcopter, it's like, oh my God, these students are doing awesome things. But what you don't realize is that all those parts had already been designed by somebody else, and they just printed them off. And they did have to assemble them, but there was no actual designing the quadcopter themselves. And the art teacher was great, because she was kind of like someone was like observing all of this, and she was, I'm so glad I interviewed her. So her, and she was a little salty about her. She lost some of her art room space. She had a pottery, and it became part of the Fab Lab. So she had a keen eye on what was going on in the Fab Lab. So what she said is she really thought, she said something really powerful that she's, and then I'll read her quote, was that the Fab Lab is a tool-centric space. The students learn how to use the tools. But she said they're just tools. They're not designing anything. The tools should not be the focus. It should be using the tools to design this other thing or solve this other problem. And so she says, if we're constantly doing technology and not art, there's no creativity. I go into the room, the Fab Lab, and I don't see anything creative in the Fab Lab. They might know how to do a circuit board, and they might do the technology part of it, but the aspect that is missing, I think, is creativity. And we'll look at this. They made circuit boards, but they didn't know what to do with them. How can you take this further? I'm looking at this. It's a tool. It's like a paintbrush, or it's like anything else. But I think you have to design first before you actually create. And part of the reason that was really difficult is because you have math and science teachers teaching Fab Lab, and they have no background in engineering at all. And so they were just given all this amazing technology, but they don't really know how to use it as a tool. It becomes the thing instead of the tool to this bigger thing. Other advice I gave them was, it is not clear to me that anyone knows the design process or it has been made explicit to the students. So some of the advice I gave, some of the things I didn't see happening was, do students know how to define their problem? Are there any actual problems that they're trying to solve? I sometimes didn't see that either. Can students identify their audience? Like, what are they making this thing for? Why would these people want this thing? Or what problem is it going to solve for them? Also, another thing that I would definitely warn against anyone using digital fabrication technologies is the students would often, they would have to use different programs, but they were never encouraged to first sketch on paper, and they found it incredibly hard to just do it on the computer without any background at all in like 2D or 3D drawing, and it was a real barrier because once they made, they didn't know the like AutoCAD or they used SolidWorks. They didn't know it well enough to, when they couldn't make what they want, how to use the tools to like change it. So that was one thing I encouraged. Do the students understand the difference between a prototype and a final product? I never saw any prototypes. I always just said final products. And if it didn't work out they wanted, they just moved on to the next project. There was no iteration. Are they given time to create multiple prototypes? Are students given opportunities to evaluate their prototypes? Can they identify design trade-offs like material costs, sustainability, temperature properties? There was none of this happening. When activities appear sciencey, so the best example I can give you from my study was making and programming a circuit board. So when I asked the Fab Lab instructors where they see students engaging in science, they must always refer to electronics, specifically the Eagle project. So this was what they were supposed to do. Take the board that they created. So they first cut out the board, and then they were to modify, adding a processor, an input device, and change the voltage to the more appropriate 5V with regulator. To me, as someone who knows nothing about circuitry, I was like, that looks like a lot of science. There's a lot. It looks very sciencey. They lit up a LED bulb. That was the goal of this project. In reality, the students followed a tutorial. So they made it, the CNC cut out all the lines, they soldered the materials on there, and then it was like the student, they programmed it, but the programming was already written out for them, so they just put it in. And then it was like they just prayed that it worked, because some students ended up making like 5 of these, and none of them worked. So they did, it was like, please work, this is like giving me 2 weeks to do. And they documented the process, which they really were just rewriting down what the tutorial said. And so when I asked the students, how do you think making a circuit board helps you engage in science, or what did you learn, what science did you learn by creating the circuit board? This is what the instructor said. Now when they look at an LED light, they know how that thing works. They know how many ohms of resistance it is. They know how a battery works. When they go to calculus class, he's making a lot of assumptions about students who take this class. You learn Ohm's law in calculus, right? Why do you learn Ohm's law in calculus? Because it applies here. So that's what I think is really cool, is they develop their own need to know, and they surpass all of us. I never once heard a student talking about Ohm's law or the need to know Ohm's law to complete the project. But if you have a background like this instructor did with circuitry, he's thinking about Ohm's law. So he's assuming that the students are also thinking about these questions about resistance and things like that.
In their sequence, have they had physics yet? Have they?
Some of them have.
Yeah. Ohm's law?
Yeah. When I asked a student, and this is what I would typically get when I ask a student how they engage in science with a circuit board. You know, with the LEDs, you have to know well, it's like the charges. Like I made a battery holder for the programmer to program a board, and so I had to connect the negative charges and the positive to certain places, so I mean science and stuff.
Oh, wow.
That was pretty typical of my answers. All right. So, looking back as a science teacher, there were so many rich opportunities to teach science and math. But my advice to the teachers was like, you have to first start out with the problem you want them to solve and the concepts that they're going to need to solve it. And then you figure out what tools will best help them do that, to engage in those ideas. And so if you take a tool-centric approach where I want this to do a 3D printer project, and you work from there, then you're not going to get as rich, I think, as of a lesson or a unit. But this talk is I'm definitely not anti-digital fabrication tools. To me, this is like a cautionary tale of a school that got a lot of funding and a lot of technology, and they think they're doing STEM, but as a researcher, I didn't really see it there. And I think there's a lot of potential there. It's just teachers, I think, for one, we're not trained to work interdisciplinary. Like, as a science teacher, I've never been trained to work with a math teacher or with technology or engineering. And it's so important that the technology just got too ahead of us, I think, in some ways. Didn't catch up with the teacher education that needs to be happening. All right, so that was my first findings about how science showed up in the rhetoric and the material culture of the Fab Lab. My second findings have to do with creating the learning environment. The Fab Lab was designed to be, my findings are, the Fab Lab was designed to be comfortable, but not with everyone in mind. I'll come back to this word comfortable. It was designed to make students on the advanced placement coursework path feel comfortable based on their cultural preferences, identity, and educational trajectories. Instead of democratizing access to STEM tools, activities, and identities, the Fab Lab's reliance on popular images of science and STEM and its alignment with the advanced placement coursework path reinforced assumptions about work and intelligence and sorting practices that privilege middle-class white students who take AP courses. So, back to this idea of a comfortable learning environment. Comfortable was used more than any other word when the instructors described why the Fab Lab was designed like a lab and not a traditional shop classroom. Mr. Mitchell, the guy who helped start it, he says, one of the most important things is to have everyone feel welcome, and I don't think a noisy, dusty workshop is welcome to everyone. So again, the ShopBot room, it was noisy and dusty, but they created a separate room for it so you could close all the doors, it had windows, and that a student could go in, put in the computer things, press start, and then leave the room. And so they never had to get dusty, they didn't have to hear the noise, and they designed it so that students would feel more comfortable around, I guess, that machine. The art teacher described it as a very sterile environment. Like I said, it was white walls, these lab benches. There was not a lot of character to it. Risk and safety is something I noticed was so different with the wood shop. So because in digital fabrication, the machines are doing all of the actual making, cutting, and all that stuff, there wasn't the risk and safety issues that the woodworking students had to deal with. I was so surprised when I went into the woodworking shop that the teacher was constantly, if they weren't making something, they were talking about the safety and risk of the machines. And whereas in the Fab Lab, you could hang out by the computer while a 3D printer was like printing your thing. The wood shop, you can't hang out next to your friends who are using the bandsaw. There were actual lines painted on the floor that you need to stay away from the machine when it's in operation or the person using it so that a piece of wood doesn't fly off and hit you, which actually one did while I was observing one time. And so there's hardly any risk or safety issues in the Fab Lab. And it just, the wood shop is noisy, it's dusty, so kids aren't socializing in there because you have to be focused on what you're doing. So if the idea of comfortable means no risk, then the Fab Lab was more comfortable. I'm not, when I say comfortable, I think these are cultural preferences for certain people as far as what they're comfortable with, I guess. I think in American society, we don't value dirty, noisy jobs. We often pay people who engage in them less money. We think of them as less educated. And I saw of how we treated the wood shop versus the Fab Lab and what students were engaging in both. Those kind of things showed up. So again, there's no computers in the woodworking shop. If the students wanted to look for a design to kind of mimic, there were old woodworking magazines, and they found something that they wanted to do. But there was no computers in there. And it was one thing that was really interesting about the shop bot. So that's a CNC machine that they created a separate room for. Originally, it was housed in the wood shop. And when it was housed there, at least the students could walk back and forth and see students who were woodworking and then come back. But then once they completed the room, they put it in there because they could contain the noise and the dust. But the shop bot never existed in the Fab Lab where it could be noisy and dirty, which I think is an interesting artifact to look at how it changed rooms and the boundaries that were able to be created by creating that separate room. One group of students, Mr. Mitchell believed, were not comfortable were female students. So when he talks about creating a comfortable environment, he often talks about, well, we want more girls creating things, doing engineering. He says, our goal is to have as many girls walking into this space and falling in love with engineering technology. We design a space so that everyone feels comfortable walking in. It's not a traditional shop space in any sense, and that was on purpose. And then he talks about how there was a student who wanted to go to the lab, a girl, the 3D printer had created ridges in her thing she made, and she wanted to sand them off. So he said we had to go to the shop, so we put on the safety glasses, went to the shop, and I showed her how to do it, and it was noisy and dusty. There were all boys in there. She commented on that. There were no girls. I said, that's right. That's why we have the Fab Lab. What was so interesting is it never occurred to him. For him, it was always the dust and the noise that kept the girls away. Not the fact that maybe there were no female teachers teaching any of these classes. The fact that maybe the school needed to invest in power drills that girls could actually use. You know, there was no thinking that maybe there's other things we could be doing that girls would want to be in there. I found that really troubling because I grew up in rural Missouri. I learned how to weld in high school. And there was never a sense where, but I was also on the college prep track. And there was never a sense that I felt uncomfortable. It was just, I needed a teacher to like show me how to do it and see that I had a place in there. So I always thought that was interesting. The ironic thing is, there wasn't any girls in the Fab Lab either. So there was 2 in the class I observed out of like 18 boys, and there were like none in the advanced class. So that was Fab Lab 1. So it'd been really cool to stick around for another year and see if those girls took more Fab Lab classes. But there were girls that took woodworking, not in the one class they observed. But it's not like there were equal representation now all of a sudden in the Fab Lab. There wasn't. There was like 2 out of 20 kids. So I thought that was, that never like crossed his mind or whatever.
Are they addressing the gender?
I asked them about that, and they said, yeah, of course we want to get more girls. And they were training a female teacher to teach Fab Lab, hoping that would encourage more girls to be a part of it. Yeah.
This was the first year of the class?
No, this was like third year of the Fab Lab.
And it's like an
But it's an introductory course.
and it's an elective, like they sign up at the end of the previous year.
So more girls were taking art classes, the home ec classes. I think it could also be said that, I think we shouldn't assume girls, don't want to learn like how to use a power drill or saws or whatever, and that if we can, I also don't want to make the assumption that like girls, well, if we were like making jewelry in the Fab Lab, that they'd want to be in there, because that's also making assumptions about them, and what they want to do. But there's probably lots of reasons why the girls weren't showing up. That would be another study. That would be really interesting. But making the room comfortable by making it clean and quiet was still not enough to get the girls to come in and do it. So, and then so they created the Fab Lab to reach out to girls. That was one of their goals. Within the Fab Lab's alignment with the Advanced Placement Coursework path. I saw this in multiple ways. The Fab Lab instructors, of course, taught advanced courses. So when they were advertising the Fab Lab, they got to recruit those students. So that was part of it. But one thing that really stuck out to me was the cultural assumptions about who takes woodshop versus who's going into like engineering and like the STEM fields. And this showed up. Andy took both wood shopping and Fab Lab. And I asked him, so what do you think of the shop tools versus the Fab Lab tools? Do you have a preference? And he said, I prefer the shop tools because I'm a lot better at them. And I said, why do you think that is? And he says, because I'm good with my hands more than my brain. And I thought that was really telling about how he sees the tools and which ones require more intelligence than others. I found that extremely troubling because I saw in many ways more math going on in the wood shop than I did in the Fab Lab. Because in the Fab Lab, you just punch in the numbers you want in the computer. You don't actually ever have to measure anything because the computer's going to do all that for you. Whereas in the shop class, students, they all carried measuring devices. I saw them use protractors and compasses. I heard language like you need to find the tangent and then cut along the tangent. And that was like, as a science teacher who'd never spent time in a wood shop, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so rich with opportunities to teach math. And I didn't see those same ones in the Fab Lab. So when you hear students say, I don't use my brain as much in wood shop, it's really troubling, but there's a long history of those assumptions. So it's unfortunate, though, when a space like the Fab Lab is helping to reinforce those ideas. Yes?
So Andy liked shop more, but just in general, do you feel like students liked Fab Lab? Like, did they enjoy the class?
I think they did. They really liked printing off things like cell phone cases and stuff like that. But I saw more frustration in the Fab Lab than the woodworking. Because the woodworking shop, you could quickly learn the tools, and you can make cuts so fast, and you could do things so quickly. Whereas in the Fab Lab, you had to learn the technology. And then sometimes students would print things that would take 9 hours. And so there was just a lot of like downtime, and if the 3D printer broke, then it was like, oh gosh, like I can't do my project. And so you're waiting for it to get fixed. So I saw a lot more frustration with the technology. Another time, Andy once referred to a group of students in the shop as hicks who don't care about school, which he was taking woodshop classes, but he even knew well enough that he knew the assumptions about those students, and even though he liked woodshop, he didn't want me to think that he was one of those students. So he made it very clear to me that, hey, I take woodshop, but I'm not like the typical woodshop student. This was from in the instructor I observed. I was asking him why his calculus students don't take tech ed courses. And he said calculus students might not be interested in taking courses in the tech ed department. Well, I think there's this perception, at least there was at our school, that those classes are not for smart kids. Smart kids should be taking other classes. So even the Fab Lab instructors were aware of these assumptions about who takes woodshop versus Fab Lab. And so Mr. Carson is aware of the commonly held assumption that tech ed students are not the smart kids who take AP and other college-prepared courses. He was also aware that his AP calculus students might not want to be associated with those assumptions. And so not only comfortable was this physical idea, it was also creating a space where AP students felt comfortable doing projects that they didn't feel comfortable doing in the woodworking shop, and I'm sure they were also fascinated by the technology. There's a lot of reasons they took Fab Lab, I'm sure. You know, they would say, like, the technologies are really cool. I want to do that. But I think somewhere in there, the Fab Lab was created for those AP students who were not taking home ec or wood shop or metal shop or art classes. That there was this, they saw this, like, space that these group of students who weren't doing that. They were just taking college prep classes. So they wanted to create a place where they felt comfortable. And part of feeling comfortable is feeling like they're taking a class where they're seen as the smart kids. And as far as like who was taking Fab Lab, when I would interview them and ask them what they're doing after college, they all said engineering. They all listed these really nice universities that they wanted to go to. I didn't hear a single student say that they planned to go into the trades, which in the wood shop, those were the jobs that were talked about. This idea of comfortability was, I think, came up in multiple ways.
Did you say that the lab had funding from engineering firms?
Yes.
And so they're trying to beef up their pipe?
Yeah, and so when I asked why are these engineering firms giving the school so much money, they would always say, well, they're hoping the students will come back and like be hired once they go to college. All right, so some things I thought. The Fab Lab was designed to be comfortable, but not with everyone in mind. It was designed to make students on the advanced placement coursework feel comfortable based on their cultural preferences, identity, and educational trajectories. Students often absent from the Fab Lab: female students, students of color, students with learning disabilities. That came up when I interviewed the science teacher. The students had to document everything that they had to do, every step. So the idea with the Fab Lab is like you can give your plans to someone else and they can create the exact same thing. So they had to create all this documentation, whereas students that had reading or writing disabilities often got really frustrated and just left the class. At-risk students the Fab Lab was considered to be like a harder class, even though I didn't really see that. So it really discouraged students who like needed to graduate to not take those classes. And then of course students on the work-based coursework path. And that's the terms they use. Work-based was students not going to college. So this idea that the maker movement is this democratizing movement where everyone's involved, I didn't see that in this case. In this space. So why should we care? Probably for a lot of reasons, but two that stood out to me. Images of science may provide cover for a curriculum that does not engage students in science as it's defined in the NGSS and the framework. It's really easy to appear to be doing science. I find it troubling when it's that easy. And the design and implementation of making and STEM, STEAM, curricula, and learning environments can reinforce social sorting practices by separating and concealing the skills and intelligences of students who work with more traditional technologies. And the best example I have of that, there was a student that was so good at woodworking, and he showed up one day with something he'd been working on by himself. and it looked like, his project looked like a maker activity. So what he did was it was a solid piece of wood, and he created a slot, and then he had cut like a circular shape on another end, and it was like an amplifier. And he turned on a song on his phone, he put it in the slot, and it amplified in the room. And it was all wood, and it seemed like something that a kid in a Fab Lab would make, because it's all about like using, you know, like, you know, these digital technologies. So like the students would often make things for their cell phone, and it's, you know, and I've seen maker projects where you use Arduinos to make speakers or something but this kid had made something that was so, I mean, it was just wood, but it achieved some of the same goals that you would see with digital fabrication technologies. And he had done it on his own, and he was just like, that was the first time I was like, it's such a shame that there is this boundary that's been created between the wood shop and the Fab Lab. This kid should have access to all these technologies so that he can, I think in some ways it's beautiful to be limited to your technologies. So just working with wood, he made something that was really neat. And he said he got the idea off YouTube, which the maker movement is all about, like kids sharing ideas and doing all this. But he had designed it himself. He saw it, and he said he created the plans for it, and he sketched it out. And so it was such a, as an educator, I was just thinking, what a shame that the kids in the Fab Lab don't get to see this project. And vice versa, that he doesn't get to share his project. And the kids in the Fab Lab who are taking AP Calculus, and they don't get to see the intelligence of this kid and what he was able to do. So, anyways, open to questions. That was, there were so many things I looked at in my dissertation, so many good quotes that I didn't include, but yeah, if you have any questions about the environment, or I would love to.
It seems to be a real lack of hypothesis in all of this. You know, they just don't seem to have a, it's part of the design process, I guess, or part of science, but I don't, it just doesn't, it seems to be totally vacuum of hypothesize something before you do it.
Oh, for my research?
Yeah. No, in the actual Fab Lab.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, you got a question back there?
Go ahead.
No, what was, so when you talked to the art teacher, and the art
Yeah.
teacher was kind of skeptical of what was going on over there, and then you went back to the school and shared, were you worried about relationships that were, you know, that was going to come out, and, you know, that there was going to be this tension between the faculty, or was that tension already exist? Or was she concerned at all that what she was saying was going to be shared with the administration?
Well, I didn't share anything that anyone had said, because there were kind of some of my interviews with, like, the science teacher who hadn't taught yet in there, and the art teacher, they definitely were critical in some ways. Like, the science teacher was really one that, like, there's not a lot of girls in there, and it's really discouraging that I don't see a lot of our students of color or at-risk students. So she would say that. And then the art teacher would say other things, being critical of, like, nobody knows design in there. They're just, so I didn't, when I met with a superintendent, a curriculum person, and then the two participants that I was observing in the classroom. So they were really receptive to my feedback as far as, and I was nervous. It was just like, it doesn't appear that there's any design going on. And I would ask them, do students know the design process? And they were like, you know, I don't think so. And then, you know, because if you go in the woodworking class, there was a design, like, circle in it, you know. So they were, I think they really, I will give them credit, they do really want to improve the Fab Lab. I think they just started off on the wrong foot by getting all these technologies before they developed an actual STEM curriculum. So they were definitely open to like how to incorporate more science and math. So I would say they were really receptive to my feedback. Yeah.
Relationship, carrying on to what he said. Did they have discussion about cross-curricular? Was that something that they saw happening in the future, more interdisciplinary?
Yeah.
Work with the art teacher? And the other part of that question is, you mostly said STEM, but in parts of your presentation, we saw the art was integrated. Did they use STEAM much, or was it STEM plus the arts, or did they not understand?
Yeah,
that
so they use STEAM like when they're like kind of purpose statement, but I didn't see a lot of that. The art teacher though, she would often come over and use the laser printer and stuff in really cool ways. So she would make, so for instance, she said she had this unit where they did wood cutting and they would make stamps, and she made them do it by hand, but then they would take their design and put it on SolidWorks and then they cut it on the laser. And that was like a really great, so she wanted to show how you could, so she used the equipment really well, but there was no, they weren't asking her to help create curriculum for the Fab Lab.
And that wasn't discussed?
No, that wasn't, yeah. She was not on their list as far as like bringing people over to the Fab Lab. The science teacher was.
Yeah, I guess one of the questions is, how typical or atypical is this, Fab Lab that you study? I suspect it's, all too typical. And could you point to a school system in the United States that particularly stands out with respect to, their handle on how to, utilize these technologies effectively to teach science? And just my second question, if I can, there are things online like the Tinkering Laboratory, Coursera. Can you point to one of these online resources for teachers that you think is very good in helping them to figure out, how to use these things correctly?
So if you go to, there's a US Fab Lab network, and there are high schools around the country that have adopted this model. And in fact, they had a screen on their back wall where you could watch 6 or 7 different classrooms happening at once, and it was like they were all connected, and you could but I see it more at the community college level. Like they're getting, I guess, there's a lot of money going into community colleges for this type of equipment. So that was a lot of them. So there are a handful of schools around the country that have adopted this same Fab Lab model that's like exclusively digital. But I don't think it's like they haven't created a movement that everyone's gonna latch onto. As far as being done successfully, in a school, in Missouri currently there's no school that I know of that has this equipment, but there is a professor, Ben Shapiro, that I don't think he's at Tufts anymore.
He's at Colorado Boulder.
Yeah, but when he was there, he helped start one in Boston, and they had both technologies, both more traditional and digital. And so in his research, he kind of just let students do whatever they wanted to, gravitate, and they actually gravitated toward the woodworking materials. And so that's kind of interesting. And then also, as far as STEM in making goes, Angela Calabrese-Barton has a really great article, but it's an after-school program. I haven't seen this happen very successfully in public ed, but after-school programs, museum, I've seen it much more successful. And she does a really great job of creating an environment where students, they create like e-textiles. Like there's a case where a little girl makes a jacket and it like lights up, but like they actually learned some science about circuitry and did that kind of thing. So, but I haven't seen it at a scale like to a high school.
Can you repeat her name again?
Angela Calabrese-Barton. She's at Michigan State.
I've been working on maker ed research for the past 6 years. I was going to share some other spots.
Oh, yeah.
So the project I worked on is called Agency by Design, and Harvard Graduate School then at Project Zero, and worked with Erica Halverson.
Yeah, she was on my committee.
Yeah, I thought so. But I think first of all, just what you shared today, I don't know if you'd be able to like type it up into a short case study, because we get calls over and over again.
Yeah.
Because everybody they have a funder, they want the shiny stuff and a space. Everybody's willing to fund the tools and not to think about the ecosystem of teaching and learning and what they value already and what's already happening that's of value, and how to think broad systemically about it. So you're like, if that could be typed up.
I know.
I could hand it to like a ton of districts.
It's really hard to be a high school teacher and
I know.
work on. But no, I totally.
We should talk
totally get that. I will definitely, if anyone wants my dissertation.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna but Albemarle County in Virginia, Albemarle County in Virginia is one place at least where there's a superintendent champion. She's not retiring, but she was a longtime superintendent champion. I've seen no perfect Fab Lab model that's staying within Gershenfeld's perfect. The dropping in of Fab Lab is running into this kind of stuff sort of everywhere, because it's quite constrained and it's a little bit fraught. But how people think about maybe Fab Lab with an ecosystem of other making, there's potential. And then if you look at like a school like Wilmerding in San Francisco, which is a private school that has a long history of shops and engineering, like jury quality products come out of all their shops, and the way they've treated their history of wood making and metal making and then brought in new technologies. There are some places, and some of it I can share that research, but your case study of how dropping in just the shiny tool piece that Fab Lab got excited about, and also they just set up a thing for scale, and scale often that it has to be carried out in each context, and it's being sort of dropped in.
Yeah.
And it comes from MIT, so it must be wonderful.
Well, and it's funny you mention that, because the circuit board, another quote I didn't include was when I asked how are students engaging in science, he said, well, people at MIT, this is an MIT level activity. So that alone was like, that's all I really need to tell you about why science is
Just one thing to look at is MIT through this cool problem cog in the works, which is really interesting, which is they opened up maker portfolios as entry into MIT, and so it's on the open portfolio project as well. And that's another fraught space, because they didn't know what that looks like to accept them, but if MIT accepts them, something big's going to happen. But when you look at the models of the MIT portfolios, they have kids who did their own metalworking and made their own guns to drones. Like, it really ranges across. Where I think that your art teacher would have and students doing fashion design and etc. And those videos are the maker portfolios. They're just 2-minute portfolio videos, and they're online. And that's a space to look at. Again, more busting of the ecology rather than the clean space you design.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think I saw.
Two quick questions. Did you see any coding or software development take place with him?
Yeah. So some students in the later classes ended up being able to do other things with their circuit boards, but they were pretty limited. So like, with the circuit boards, the students weren't doing coding. They were just putting in stuff that had already been written for them. Another thing I talked with the instructor with extensively was he was the only teacher in the school that had done any coding, and there is no teacher education program currently, no certification program for computer science. So again, it's like teacher ed isn't ready yet for some of these technologies in certain states. I'm sure other states have computer science certifications.
And also, while you've been focused at the high school level, are there any unique questions or concerns that you would raise to a junior high school principal or a middle school principal who was attracted by the same shiny object and wanted to retrain his or her librarians to become maker gurus? anything unique that would be, of bigger concern implementing this down at a middle school level?
No, I would say at that level it's still like everything should apply. Like librarians, of course, they would need extensive research to be able to use the tools and to help students in ways that were really educative. But I think another issue that I saw is the Fab Lab here had a lot of money. They often talked about how they still had like $100,000 to help give more resources, materials, which most schools don't have. And so they were able to send their 3D printers away to get fixed. And from my understanding, there's a lot of schools with broken 3D printers in libraries.
Yeah.
So that's something I think you have to, if you're going to take the shiny object, you have to know that either someone needs to know how to work on them or you're going to have to pay for someone to work on it because someone will put a project through there that takes 23 hours and it will break down in the middle of it. Yeah.
I was under the impression that MIT had a Fab Lab that was very noisy and very.
They do, but they're, what's the guy's name? He wrote a book called Fab.
Yeah.
I think they do. Well, it's interesting because he's on, or he used to be like on the board for the U.S. Fab Lab network, but it's also kind of an offshoot. Even though they do like the trainings, there's like
I think it's turned into its own animal.
It has.
The Fab Lab your model came from was more of a, high-tech tool-oriented clean space.
So yeah, there's the MIT, but they have created a website for Fab Lab. And in it, it's like how to start one, and then it's like the ideal setup. And so they ran with that was like, this is the only setup, So when you have, I think, teachers looking at it, they're not thinking about the trade-offs of not having any woodworking tools. They're just seeing, well, this is MIT's ideal lab setup, so.
So it must be good.
And it's also, I would be interested in asking, maybe the Fab Lab model is under the assumption that schools already have woodworking shops, so they don't need to suggest bandsaws and planers, so that teachers should be using those. So that when they say ideal, I mean it's probably maybe technologies that most people don't have. Yeah.
It seems like the issue is more with the curriculum than the technologies or the tools. Did they get the curriculum from MIT? Or
no,
just
and that's the
tools?
thing, the way MIT trains is these same activities the students were doing. So instead of creating curriculum around the tools, the teachers had done the same activities in the MIT training, and so they were like, well, then we'll just have the students do the same thing. So the training was about the technology, not about science and engineering or design.
And that's what they're doing at MIT?
No, they're doing really cool stuff, but they already know how to use the stuff. But I think teachers see the MIT training as, well, this is what we will also train the students. So then it just becomes about the tools, training the tools. And you can fill up an entire semester class of just like learning how to do it, because unlike the learning how to use a planer, in a day, it takes several weeks to learn how to do SolidWorks or like how to, set up the shopbot appropriately. I think later on in like the Fab Lab 3 class, although after Fab Lab 1, it was kind of an open lab classes where students could make whatever they want. So again, there's still no curriculum around like what projects they choose to do or if there's any math or science that teachers are hoping that they're learning. Yes?
If anybody's interested locally, I'm here at Dartmouth High. I teach engineering and robotics, and we are in the middle of this.
Yeah.
Putting this in, essentially. We have 2 shops already that have added a lot of tech. and we got some big grants to do that. So if anybody's interested in taking a look at it, or possibly they want to do this in our library.
Yeah.
And I don't know what role I can't walk away from my table saw, so
Yeah.
I don't know what role I'm gonna play.
Yeah.
I was hoping you spoke up, Sam, because I've been to Sam's shop, and Sam's shop is not this.
Yeah.
Sam's your engineering lab. I mean, he has the table saw, has the bandsaw, has all those woodworking tools, and then he's like, "Okay, kids, wipe off the tables. Let's get the laptops out, and let's go to program this robot that we're building over here." And it's not this. It's a mix of
You haven't seen it lately.
both of those things.
We just
Yeah.
$200,000 worth of shelf pots.
Yeah.
Awesome. But yeah, kind of along those lines, I want, I think somebody looked at the shiny pictures and was like, we want that. Let's try and get that.
Mhm.
Where can I direct them for this, like, warning?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not like, be
You can
like,
print out your dissertation.
Yeah.
well, nobody's gonna read your dissertation.
Yeah. I'll take out the
Like you said,
methods
you're a
and
teacher, and the administrator
Yeah.
is busier than the teachers, so,
Yeah.
but like a 5-minute thing that I could sort of warn.
Well, I mean, I could give you my one pager that I created for the teachers. That was kind of like my feedback as far as that.
That would actually be super
Do you
helpful.
have a website or someplace we can find that?
I don't, but I can.
Can we post it along with the talk, Chandra?
Put it on-
Yeah, if you send it to me, we can figure out somewhere to post it.
We've got the video to talk to.
Well, yeah, but this is a one pager of the
Oh, yeah, I
of
guess.
all the findings.
Mhm.
I mean, actually, Kim Sullivan, who has, she's at Nueva School in San Francisco, which, the IDEO dad's
Yeah.
children go there, so she got an IDEO lab dropped into her
Nice.
school. It's amazing. She has every bell and whistle you could want, because IDEO dropped a design lab in there. She does teach a design process, she understands.
Yeah.
But and she's been in there for a long time, she does teacher training, and she has some sound bites. The most valuable tool in her lab is cardboard and glue guns, and then other people have argued even they actually teach tab making, so students understand that glue gun isn't reality in design, but you need to understand folding tabs and how things come together. But she has some stuff said about that, but I think you need an email, that, you see all this stuff, and then you see actually the kids are all in there with like cutters and cardboard and prototyping until they touch stuff.
I would, if I was going to do another dissertation, I would thought about. I love grad school. I'm so sad that I'm already out. But it would be so neat. There were so many moments where I was like, oh, you could be teaching the science concept. So it'd be so cool to do like a design-based research where like the first semester I'm just there like helping to like develop curriculum, and then we like implement it the next time around, and just like how do you work with a woodshop teacher to make the math concepts explicit for the students, so that it's so important that they understand just how intelligent they are, and that they levels of math that they use, or their understanding of science, different science concepts. I think that would be a really powerful thing for students. All right, is that it?
Thank you.
Well, thank you for
And thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many new faces here. I hope to see you all again next year.